Buon pomeriggio a tutti.
So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to this afternoon session. And before the start of the new lecture, I would like to provide you with the practical information. Tomorrow we will have a slight schedule adjustment. On Tuesday, the 9th of April, tomorrow, the session will start at 9:45. At 9:45. We will start with Tyler, then Professor D'Angelo, and afterwards a discussion. In the afternoon, the lessons will follow according to the official program instead. So thank you. Thanks for your attention. So let's now come to the presentation by Daniel Jacquard from the École pratique des hautes études in Paris, who will report about a topic she is very well acquainted with, medicine history. This is the title, Science et médecine au XIe siècle en Occident. So science and medicine in the 11th century in the Western world.
It is the 5th time that I have the honor to be invited at Spoleto Settimana. So I have acquired the bad habit of giving my lesson in French. I realized too late that this year it would not be translated, and I had not enough time in order to prepare it seriously in another language. So I will give it in French, I'm sorry. Les figures de Gerbert d'Aurillac, devenu le pape de l'an 1000 Sylvestre II, et d'Abond de Fleury, mort à 1 an d'intervalle, pour le premier en 1003, pour le second en 1004, ont donné au Xe siècle, dans le domaine de l'histoire des sciences, un éclat parfois qualifié de troisième renaissance carolingienne. L'historiographie a aussi gratifié d'une renaissance le XIIe siècle, un siècle, il est vrai, qui, de son début à sa fin, fut porteur d'innovation et d'ouverture décisive dans le domaine des sciences, de la médecine et de la philosophie. Ce fut le temps par excellence des traductions à la fois du grec et de l'arabe au latin. Porter son regard sur le XIe siècle, c'est à la fois suivre, à travers des textes identifiables et datables, la réalité de la première importation de savoirs arabes et mesurer la portée qu'eurent les réalisations effectuées lors de ce siècle pour le développement ultérieur des sciences et de la médecine. Le XIe siècle, de ce point de vue, n'offre pas un continuum, ni dans le temps, ni dans l'espace. Puisque mon sujet est centré sur la rencontre des cultures, à savoir celles qui furent illustrées en grec, en arabe et en latin, je consacrerai les 2 premières parties de cet exposé à l'importation de savoirs arabes en Occident latin, d'abord à travers l'introduction de l'astrolabe dans les premières décennies, puis à travers l'apport massif de nouvelles sources médicales traduites surtout de l'arabe, mais aussi du grec, dans la seconde moitié du siècle. Quant à ma 3e partie, elle sera orientée vers l'essor scientifique en Espagne musulmane lors de ce même XIe siècle, un essor dont ont bénéficié les lettrés latins au siècle suivant. Sans prétendre apporter quelques nouveautés, c'est une sorte de tableau d'ensemble que je vous propose en 3 volets. Le cheminement de l'astrolabe à travers les monastères bénédictins dans la première moitié du XIe siècle, les traductions d'œuvres médicales en Italie méridionale dans la seconde moitié du XIe siècle, et enfin, le rayonnement scientifique de Tolède avant sa reprise par les chrétiens en 1085. Donc, l'introduction de l'astrolabe. Il n'est pas facile de traiter de la première introduction de cet instrument qui va devenir indissociable de la figure de l'astronome médiéval. Cette histoire est encombrée de controverses entre spécialistes, de revirements, parfois aussi d'attachements régionalistes. Jusqu'à récemment, l'historiographie était dominée par la recherche du rôle qu'aurait pu jouer Gerbert d'Aurillac, dont on sait qu'il fit un voyage en Catalogne entre 967 et 970, et qu'il correspondit après son retour avec un certain Loupitus ou Lobet de Barcelone, auquel il demanda dans une lettre de 984 de lui envoyer un Liber de Astrologia dont l'identification a beaucoup stimulé l'imagination des spécialistes. Désormais, mis à part quelques résurgences malencontreuses dues à des compilations bibliographiques mal contrôlées, il est admis que Gerbert n'a pas joué de rôle dans l'introduction de l'astrolabe en Europe latine, malgré son intérêt pour l'astronomie et l'enseignement qu'il a pu délivrer en tant qu'écolâtre de Reims au moyen de divers instruments. Sans entrer dans les méandres de cette histoire compliquée, je vais tenter de rassembler les éléments qui semblent la jalonner de manière fiable. Il existe un ensemble de textes en latin dont l'origine arabe ne fait pas de doute, ne serait-ce que par la forme fortement arabisée de certains mots décrivant l'astrolabe et indiquant ses utilisations. Ces adaptations, que les spécialistes regroupent sous le nom de corpus primitif, se fondent sur des ouvrages arabes à relier à l'école d'un célèbre savant de l'Espagne musulmane, Maslama al-Majriti, c'est le premier nom que j'ai mis sur mon PowerPoint, qui, né à Madrid, mourut à Cordoue en 1007 ou 1008. En outre, il semble probable que l'auteur ou les auteurs des adaptations latines aient eu sous les yeux un astrolabe fabriqué en Espagne musulmane. Les informations contenues dans ces textes permettent de dater ces adaptations des 2 dernières décennies du Xe siècle et de situer leur origine en Catalogne. Longtemps, l'histoire de ces textes s'est focalisée sur le manuscrit Ripoll 225, conservé aux archives de la couronne d'Aragon à Barcelone, et cela en relation toujours avec la supposée intervention de Gerbert d'Aurillac. La datation de ce manuscrit a fait l'objet de controverses. Il est aujourd'hui admis qu'il daterait non de la fin du Xe siècle, mais plutôt de la première moitié ou du milieu du XIe siècle. En réalité, d'autres témoins rendent compte, de manière non uniforme d'un recueil à l'autre, du corpus primitif sur l'astrolabe. En 1989, Arnaud Borst signalait l'importance de 2 feuillets conservés aux archives de la ville de Constance. Ce fragment de Constance, selon l'appellation dont usent les spécialistes, fut copié à Reichenau et est datable vers 1008. Alors que Maslama al-Majriti, l'astronome andalou, dont l'école semble avoir inspiré ce corpus primitif latin, s'est lui-même intéressé au planisphère de Ptolémée, le traité du célèbre astronome grec du IIe siècle qui expose le type de projection planisphérique mise en œuvre dans l'astrolabe, et que l'un des textes du corpus primitif, le De Utilitatibus Astrolabii, comporte un passage révélant une connaissance de cette œuvre, Paul Kunitsch a découvert dans le manuscrit latin 7412 de la Bibliothèque nationale de France, datable du milieu du XIe siècle, un extrait d'une traduction de la version arabe du planisphère, ainsi que 9 pages de dessins représentant un astrolabe dont le copiste a transcrit, comme il le pouvait, les inscriptions arabes en koufique andalou, allant même jusqu'à donner le nom du constructeur, Khalaf ibn Mouaz. Ces témoins, plus quelques autres, dont le manuscrit de Chartres 214 détruit en 1944, mais dont le contenu est à rapprocher d'un manuscrit de Corpus Christi à Cambridge, font état d'un corpus primitif transmis de manière dispersée. Si la Catalogne semble bien le lieu où ont été conçues ces adaptations latines, les voies qu'elles ont suivies ont fait l'objet de diverses hypothèses. Celle qui est retenue aujourd'hui est la suivante. Le manuscrit 225 de Ripoll ne serait pas l'un des premiers témoins du corpus primitif, dont la diffusion semble plutôt être partie de l'abbaye de Fleury, c'est-à-dire Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire. Le fragment de Constance dériverait d'un modèle apparu vers 995 à Fleury. En effet, Berne de Prune ou de Reichenau, essentiellement connu des musicologues, alla poursuivre sa formation auprès d'Abon de Fleury. Il aurait rapporté un témoin du corpus primitif à Reichenau, dont il fut l'abbé de 1008 à 1048. Berne de Prune était à Fleury en même temps que Constantin de Fleury, un ami de Gerbert d'Aurillac, lui-même aussi expert en musique, qui, à partir de 988, s'était installé à l'abbaye Saint-Mémin de Missy, dont il devint l'abbé en 1011, jusqu'à sa mort en 1020. Si l'hypothèse de l'intervention de Berne de Prune, avancée par Arnaud Borst, ne paraît pas devoir être nécessaire selon Charles Bernet, il est avéré qu'une copie du corpus primitif fut réalisée à l'abbaye de Missy. Il s'agit du manuscrit Reginensis Latinus 598 de la Bibliothèque Vaticane. En outre, c'est à un certain Stabilis de Missy, qui pourrait être confondu avec Constantin susnommé, qu'Asselin d'Augsbourg adressa à la demande de ce Stabilis son propre traité sur la composition de l'astrolabe inspiré du corpus primitif. Il semble enfin que le manuscrit 225 de Ripoll ait été la copie d'un modèle venant de Fleury. On sait que le successeur d'Abon de Fleury, Gauzelin, fut en relation avec l'abbé alors de Ripoll, Oliva, les deux abbés s'envoyant régulièrement des messagers. Ce corpus primitif sur l'astrolabe, très maladroitement écrit et difficilement compréhensible, chemina ainsi d'abbaye en abbaye grâce à des relations interpersonnelles et au voyage des moines. Le rayonnement d'un Abon de Fleury, dont les œuvres ne portent pas de traces d'influence arabe, mais manifestent dans un cadre computiste un intérêt pour l'astronomie mathématique, n'y est pas étranger. Le cheminement du corpus primitif vers l'espace germanique porta ses fruits, puisque le traité sur la composition de l'astrolabe d'Asselin d'Augsbourg, datable d'avant 1011, servit de base aux œuvres de l'un de ses disciples, Hermann de Reichenau, ou Hermannus Contractus, dit le contrefait en raison d'une infirmité de naissance. Entré au monastère de Reichenau à l'âge de 7 ans, Hermann y mourut en 1054. Il inaugura un nouveau corpus sur l'astrolabe, complété par des disciples, qui allait être la nouvelle référence jusqu'aux traductions du XIIe siècle. Notons que Hermann, outre ses talents de computiste, est lui aussi, comme Berne de Prune, connu pour ses œuvres dans le domaine de la musique. On est dans le cadre d'une prise en compte globale du quadrivium au sein de ces abbayes bénédictines de la première moitié du XIe siècle. Malgré les efforts déployés pour comprendre le maniement de l'astrolabe, les textes traduits et écrits en ce XIe siècle sont encore obscurs. Le XIIe siècle, avec ses nouvelles traductions, fut dans ce domaine, comme dans d'autres, décisif. En 1143, un autre Hermann, Hermann de Carinthie, qui se qualifiait lui-même de second Hermann, donna la première traduction latine complète, d'après l'arabe, du planisphère de Ptolémée. Il dédia sa traduction à Thierry de Chartres. On sait l'importance du rayonnement de l'école de Chartres, l'école cathédrale de Chartres au XIIe siècle, mais est bien connu aussi l'impulsion que lui donna Fulbert, écolâtre à Chartres à partir de 1004, puis évêque de 1006 à sa mort en 1028, poète, versé en médecine et dans les arts autant du trivium que du quadrivium. Parmi les poèmes qui lui sont attribués, l'un d'entre eux contient 4 verbes mnémotechniques mentionnant 8 étoiles avec leurs noms arabes. Dans le même recueil est transcrit un glossaire, peut-être plutôt attribuable à un élève qu'à Fulbert lui-même, de 28 termes techniques issus du traité Sententiae Astrolabii, l'un des textes du corpus primitif dont la connaissance semble donc attestée à Chartres au XIe siècle. Comme l'a indiqué Patrick Gauthier d'Alcher, outre la voie ouverte à un développement de l'astronomie, ces adaptations introduisirent pour la première fois dans le monde latin la latitude en tant que telle et marquent l'application aussi pour la première fois de la notion de climat à l'espace géographique, notamment à travers la lecture du De Utilitatibus Astrolabii. La première introduction de l'astrolabe au XIe siècle s'inscrit dans la ligne des travaux liés au compute, les recueils compilés dans ce cadre, initialement dédiés au calendrier liturgique et principalement à la fixation de la date de Pâques, manifestant d'ample curiosité qui pouvait même s'étendre aux techniques de divination. Or, circulèrent dans certains manuscrits du corpus primitif sur l'astrolabe des textes ouvertement astrologiques que David Juste a qualifiés d'alcandriana, qui se sont forgés autour d'un noyau originel mêlant diverses influences en Espagne musulmane et qui furent adaptés en latin par un arabophone, un mozarabe ou un juif, ou plus tard au Xe siècle. Même si ces alcandriana ne livraient pas une astrologie aussi élaborée que les textes traduits massivement au XIIe siècle, leur diffusion témoigne d'une curiosité. Les calculs astrologiques font en effet partie des utilisations de l'astrolabe, à côté de l'astronomie théorique et de l'aide apportée en géométrie pratique pour mesurer les hauteurs. Les milieux ecclésiastiques ne furent pas insensibles aux techniques divinatoires, et c'est peut-être dans ce contexte que s'explique la rédaction d'un De Nigromantia, récemment édité, attribué à Berne de Prume ou de Reichenau, datable avant 1043-1044, et qui rappelle, dans une ligne augustinienne, la nécessité pour un chrétien de se détourner des arts susceptibles de faire intervenir les démons. Ce fut aussi au XIe siècle que se diffusèrent peu à peu les chiffres dits arabes. Les premières attestations datent du Xe siècle, notamment dans le codex Vigilanus, du nom de son copiste, le moine Vigila d'Albeda, qui, en 976, dans une transcription d'un extrait relatif à l'arithmétique des étymologies d'Isidore de Séville, signale l'origine indienne et donne les formes de 9 chiffres. Gerbert d'Aurillac introduisit ces chiffres sur les jetons ou apicès des abaques à colonnes, remplaçant ainsi le système alphanumérique grec ou latin. Les formes de ces chiffres n'avaient rien de stabilisé, mais au XIe siècle, on les voit introduits avec des noms arabes ou d'ailleurs plutôt berbères, tout aussi déformés dans des textes relatifs à l'abaque, ce que Menso Folkers a qualifié de cluster abacus, pour justement insister sur le cadre monastique dans lequel les chiffres arabes se sont introduits. Après cette insertion dans le maniement de cet instrument de calcul qu'est l'abaque, ils ont servi peu à peu à numéroter les folios des manuscrits. Mais il fallut attendre les traductions du XIIe siècle pour qu'ils fussent inscrits dans une méthode de calcul arithmétique, l'arithmétique dite de position. Bon, je passe à ma deuxième partie, les traductions d'œuvres médicales. Nous resterons dans le cadre monastique, et plus spécifiquement bénédictin, en abordant un épisode majeur dans l'histoire de la médecine médiévale. Vers 1077, entre au monastère du Mont-Cassin, où il devient moine jusqu'à sa mort à une date inconnue mais antérieure à 1099, un lettré venu d'Afrique du Nord pour y traduire à partir de l'arabe entre une vingtaine et une trentaine de textes médicaux. Le corpus de textes ainsi traduits, pour la plupart originellement écrits en arabe, mais aussi quelques écrits d'origine grecque, fut décisif pour le développement de la médecine d'expression latine. Cette dernière recevait alors, pour la médecine occidentale tout court, y compris jusqu'à aujourd'hui, cette dernière recevait alors les moyens d'asseoir la pratique sur une théorie, laquelle s'était perdue dans les siècles précédents, du fait que dans l'Antiquité, elle s'était essentiellement écrite en grec et non en latin, comme d'ailleurs l'ensemble des sciences de haut niveau. Que cet épisode décisif pour le développement d'une médecine savante dans l'Occident latin se soit déroulé en Italie méridionale n'est pas un hasard et s'explique par une convergence de facteurs, indépendamment même des influences arabes qui avaient pu s'introduire par voie commerciale ou plus brutalement. Dès la fin du Xe siècle, la réputation des médecins de Salerne avait traversé les Alpes, même si sous la plume d'un Richer de Reims, il faisait plutôt figure d'empirique que de lettré. De manière plus tangible, avant le milieu du XIe siècle, un certain Gariopontus de Salerne, associé à un ancien moine du Mont Cassin, Laurent d'Amalfi, avait essayé de mettre de l'ordre dans les informations quelque peu disparates délivrées par les textes médicaux alors disponibles, à travers une sorte d'ouvrage de synthèse à usage pratique intitulé Passionarius, ce titre référant principalement à l'étude des maladies et de leur traitement. Il y avait donc en Italie méridionale, et particulièrement à Salerne, un milieu médical demandeur d'informations. La biographie de Constantin l'Africain, auquel on doit la première introduction massive de médecine arabe, est fondée sur des récits plus ou moins fiables et teintés d'aspects légendaires. Sans entrer dans le détail, j'indiquerai ce qui semble sinon avéré, du moins le plus vraisemblable. Né à Carthage, Constantin a peut-être été parfaire sa formation médicale dans l'ancienne ville du Caire, Fustat, ses biographes mentionnant Babylonia, terme qui la qualifie usuellement. Cela est possible, mais il faut rappeler que durant le Xe siècle, Kairouan, l'un des grands foyers intellectuels de l'islam, avait abrité aussi des auteurs médecins de quelque envergure. Au début du Xe siècle, 2 médecins venus d'Orient furent attirés à la cour aglabide puis fatimide, Ishaq ibn Imran, venu de Bagdad, et Ishaq al-Israéli, un lettré juif, par ailleurs philosophe néoplatonicien. Né quant à lui à Kairouan, dans une famille de médecins, Ibn al-Jazar, mort en 1004 ou 1005, fut lui aussi un auteur important. Des œuvres de ces 3 auteurs kairouanais furent traduites par Constantin l'Africain. Au sein du corpus du à ce traducteur, dont je vais vous épargner le détail, 2 textes venus de l'Orient musulman sont à retenir. L'un consistait en un abrégé que les spécialistes s'accordent à attribuer à Constantin l'Africain, peut-être sa première traduction, des questions sur la médecine de Hunayn ibn Ishaq, le prolifique traducteur d'œuvres grecques en arabe, mort à Bagdad en 877. Dans ces questions étaient introduits les grands principes du galénisme arabe, inspirés de l'enseignement de l'école d'Alexandrie tardive des 5e, 6e siècles. L'abrégé mis en latin au XIe siècle énumérait et définissait les concepts structurants sur lesquels se fonda la médecine durant tout le Moyen-Âge, voire au-delà. L'autre œuvre majeure venue de l'Orient musulman est une vaste encyclopédie médicale en 2 parties, l'une dite théorique, l'autre pratique, intitulée « Livre complet sur la médecine ». Elle avait été composée par un médecin de l'espace persan qui exerça un temps à Bagdad, Ali ibn al-Abbas al-Majouzi, dans les années 980-990. Le XIe siècle en Ifriqiya fut une période de troubles, marquée notamment par la destruction de la ville de Kairouan en 1057, ce qui n'empêcha pas pourtant les Normands d'y commercer. Constantin l'Africain quitta sa terre natale pour des raisons inconnues et vint s'installer en Italie méridionale, d'abord vraisemblablement à Salerne. Si certains récits en font un musulman d'origine, il est plus vraisemblable d'imaginer qu'il appartenait à la communauté chrétienne d'Ifriqiya, ce qui expliquerait plus facilement son bilinguisme arabe-latin. Avant d'entrer à l'abbaye du Mont-Cassin, il bénéficia de patronage à la fois laïque et ecclésiastique. Du côté laïque, de la part de Robert Guiscard, le conquérant normand de Salerne en 1076-1077, et du prince Richard de Capoue. Du côté ecclésiastique, le patronage fut de poids, puisqu'il s'agissait d'Alfano, archevêque de Salerne depuis 1058. Alfano de Salerne, qui avait effectué une ambassade à Constantinople en 1063, était lui-même médecin et traduisit du grec en latin le traité de la nature de l'homme du père de l'Église grecque Némésius d'Émèse, qui vécut au tournant des IVe et Ve siècles. Cette traduction circula sous le titre de Premnon Physikon, en étant faussement attribuée à Grégoire de Nice. Tout en se fondant dans un moule chrétien, cette œuvre délivrait un savoir médical issu des œuvres de Galien relativement au fonctionnement du corps humain et sa relation avec l'âme. Alfano de Salerne avait été moine au Mont-Cassin et ses relations avec l'abbé Desiderius, qui devint en 1086 le pape Victor III, valurent sans doute à Constantin l'Africain son entrée dans la célèbre abbaye bénédictine. Il s'y consacra à ses travaux de traduction en s'appuyant probablement sur les manuscrits arabes qu'il avait apportés depuis l'Afrique du Nord, entouré par une équipe de copistes et d'aides pour embellir son latin. La rénovation entreprise par l'abbé Desiderius, tant du point de vue architectural qu'intellectuel, marquée par une influence byzantine, l'activité du scriptorium, qui ne négligeait pas les textes médicaux, usant suivant les cas de l'écriture bénéventine ou de la Caroline, fournissait un cadre des plus favorables. Il est possible que ce fut à l'occasion du siège de Salerne que Constantin l'Africain entra au Mont-Cassin vers 1077. Ces traductions de l'arabe s'inscrivent dans un environnement hellénisé. Est-ce la raison pour laquelle il donne aux deux œuvres majeures venues de l'Orient musulman que j'ai mentionnées tout à l'heure des titres laissant entendre une origine grecque? L'abrégé des questions sur la médecine de Hunayn circule sous le nom d'Isagogé Ioannissi, tandis que le livre complet sur l'art médical d'Al-Majouzi voit son titre rendu sous l'hellénisme teinté de couleurs locales de Pantégnie, tout l'art. Si Constantin l'Africain peut s'autoriser ces détournements d'œuvres écrites originellement en arabe, c'est qu'il omet de donner le nom de l'auteur originel, les plaçant sous sa seule autorité. Étrangement, le seul nom d'auteur qu'il donne en clair est celui du médecin juif venu d'Égypte à Kérouan, Isaac Israéli. Selon certains spécialistes, il n'aurait pas effectué les traductions de ce médecin au Mont-Cassin, mais alors qu'il était encore à Salerne. Le nom d'un auteur ouvertement juif aurait-il été plus acceptable qu'un nom musulman? En outre, arrivé au Mont-Cassin, le rattachement des œuvres traduites au monde de l'islam suscitait-il quelques réticences? Il est difficile d'en décider. Plus vraisemblablement, il faut se tourner vers la méthode du traducteur, devenue dans les siècles suivants l'exemple même du traducteur infidèle. En effet, tout en rendant la cohérence des textes, en préservant l'essentiel de leur contenu, il opère des coupures et parfois des ajouts. Son ambition, ainsi qu'il l'exprime dans le prologue au Pantégnie qu'il met sous son nom et dédie à l'abbé Desiderius, est de restaurer dans le monde latin un héritage médical solide. De fait, il a réussi, car ses traductions, en particulier le Pantégnie, furent largement diffusées et assimilées au XIIe siècle, y compris auprès de lettrés non médecins qui y trouvaient matière à réflexion sur la nature de l'homme. Quant à l'Isagogé Ioannissi, elle fit l'objet d'innombrables commentaires à Salerne, puis dans les universités. l'ensemble du corpus de traduction de Constantin ne cessa d'irriguer la pensée médicale. Au XIe siècle, en Italie méridionale, on traduisit aussi du grec, ce qui était somme toute naturel. Outre le traité de Némésius traduit par Alphano de Salerne, 2 textes furent traduits du grec à partir de modèles byzantins par des anonymes. Tous 2 furent lus et commentés tout au long du Moyen-Âge en tant que guide au diagnostic, le De Ourinis de Théophile et le De Pulsibus de Philarète. Marc Laxterman nous a entretenu hier d'une traduction de l'arabe au grec d'un ouvrage d'orientation plutôt littéraire, le recueil de fables moralisatrices Kalila Wadibna. La médecine arabe bénéficia aussi au XIe siècle de ce type de transfert. Une traduction de l'arabe au grec fut réalisée de l'ouvrage principal d'Ibn al-Jazar, le Viatique du voyageur, qui fait partie aussi du corpus des traductions en latin de Constantin l'Africain. La traduction grecque date également de la seconde moitié du XIe siècle et son attribution à un Constantin de Reggio a suscité maintes interrogations dans l'historiographie depuis le XIXe siècle. L'hypothèse d'une identification des 2 Constantins sous le même personnage a été avancée, mais elle ne tient pas. La traduction latine rend le texte original arabe sous une forme abrégée, tandis que la traduction en grec est littérale et semble se référer à un exemplaire arabe qui comprenait une version revue et augmentée. Quoi qu'il en soit, cette traduction et d'autres témoignages attestent la circulation dans l'espace calabro-sicilien de textes médicaux arabes venant à la fois d'Ifriqiya et de Bagdad. La tradition manuscrite de la traduction grecque de l'ouvrage d'Ibn al-Jazar, qui fait état de remaniements successifs et de son arrivée à Constantinople, a été analysée dans la thèse de doctorat de Thibaut Miguet, dont la publication vient de paraître le 29 mars dernier. Si j'ai lu la thèse ayant fait partie du jury, je n'ai pas encore vu la version publiée. J'en viens à ma dernière partie. Ma courte dernière partie formera une sorte d'épilogue. À travers l'exposé fastidieux que je vous ai infligé, j'ai tenté de suggérer que le XIe siècle latin est marqué par un foisonnement de curiosité dans le domaine des sciences et de la médecine qui mène à se tourner vers les savoirs arabes, à la fois transmetteurs de l'héritage grec en partie perdu en latin et représentant d'une modernité riche d'innovation. Bien que menaçante, l'occupation musulmane toute proche semble propice à des transferts de savoir. Si dans la première partie du XIe siècle, l'attrait pour l'astronomie arabe et son instrument phare se concrétise par des initiatives ponctuelles et dispersées, l'entreprise de traduction dans le domaine médical menée par Constantin l'Africain est le premier exemple manifestant un programme, une équipe, une organisation. Au XIIe siècle, on traduisit du grec et de l'arabe, souvent de manière dispersée, ce qui mena parfois à des doublons, mais il y eut aussi des entreprises d'envergure. J'en prendrai 2 exemples. Les traductions du grec effectuées par Burgundio de Pise en matière de philosophie et de médecine, et surtout l'imposant ensemble touchant tous les domaines dû à Gérard de Crémone à partir de l'arabe. Les disciples de ces derniers écrivirent après sa mort en 1187 qu'il quitta sa ville natale de Crémone pour se rendre à Tolède où il mourut après y avoir passé une quarantaine d'années, pour y trouver le livre fondamental de Ptolémée sur l'astronomie, l'Almageste, texte de fait qu'il traduisit à partir de ses versions arabes et, comme il a été découvert récemment, qu'il commenta même. Tolède, au XIIe siècle, fut un haut lieu de traduction avec l'encouragement et le soutien des archevêques. On retrouve encore cette intervention d'ecclésiastiques dans l'ouverture à la culture arabe. Pour comprendre cette attirance des lettrés latins, il faut se reporter au XIe siècle andalou, parfois qualifié d'âge d'or, après la chute du califat de Cordoue en 1031 et la mise en place des royaumes dits des taïfas. Il n'y eut pas que Tolède comme foyer de science. Un roi de Saragosse, dont je vous épargne le nom, par exemple, dans la seconde moitié du XIe siècle, écrivit un ouvrage de mathématiques de très haut niveau. Mais à Tolède, c'est l'ensemble des savoirs, la philosophie, les sciences et la médecine qui sont représentés. Comme le rappelle encore dans son livre paru en 2022 Emmanuel Lxxi du Ménil, livre intitulé « Savoir et pouvoir en Al-Andalus au XIe siècle », est emblématique du rayonnement tolédan au XIe siècle, dans les décennies qui ont précédé la prise de la ville en 1085 par le roi de Léon et de Castille, Alphonse VI, l'ouvrage unique en son genre au Moyen-Âge, rédigé en 1068 par un cadi, Saïd al-Andalousi. Il mourut à Tolède en 1070. Son ouvrage, intitulé Tabakat al-Ummam, que l'on traduit généralement par catégorie des nations, classifie les nations du monde, depuis l'Inde jusqu'à l'Espagne musulmane, en fonction de leur contribution à travers les siècles à la philosophie, aux mathématiques et aux sciences. L'avant-dernier chapitre de ce livre est dédié aux savants d'Espagne musulmane qui lui sont contemporains, et en particulier à ceux qu'il fréquente à Tolède. Tous les types de savoirs sont représentés, mais une figure marquante s'impose pour expliquer le départ auquel se résolut Gérard de Crémone, celle d'un astronome que les latins désignèrent sous le nom d'Azarchiel, qui, après la prise de la ville en 1085, se réfugia à Cordoue, où il continua son activité, entouré de disciples, et où il mourut en 1100. Concepteur d'instruments, dont l'un est dénommé Saféa, auteur de tables astronomiques, perdues en arabe, mais dont la traduction latine servit de base au calcul au prix d'adaptations successives jusqu'au XIVe siècle, Azarchiel est l'un des savants qui assurèrent le rayonnement de Tolède juste avant la reprise chrétienne. Les traducteurs du XIIe siècle trouvèrent à leur arrivée dans la ville non seulement des manuscrits, mais des lettrés arabophones, mozarabes ou juifs, aptes à les aider à la fois linguistiquement et scientifiquement. Le cadi Saïd termine son ouvrage par un chapitre sur la contribution des savants juifs en Espagne. À quelques occasions dans mon exposé, j'ai mentionné l'œuvre ou l'intervention de lettrés juifs. Le XIe siècle fut aussi un grand moment pour le judaïsme, avec l'œuvre exégétique à Troyes de Rachi, dont les commentaires bibliques furent recherchés par les exégètes latins dès le XIIe siècle. Si j'ai mentionné cette référence de la culture juive, alors qu'elle est étrangère à mon sujet, puisqu'il s'agit d'exégèse biblique, même si dans l'exégèse biblique il y a beaucoup de sciences, souvent, c'est pour évoquer le foisonnement intellectuel qui a marqué le XIe siècle, porteur de curiosité envers des savoirs exprimés dans d'autres cultures et qui se sont concrétisés de manière plus systématique et créative au siècle suivant. Comme il me reste quelques minutes, bon, je vais me permettre un excursus à propos des révolutions dont il a beaucoup été question ces jours-ci. Concernant les sciences, l'expression « révolution copernicienne » est actuellement d'un usage commun, imagé, évoqué à tout propos. Il est vrai que l'ouvrage pionnier de Copernic s'intitulait « De Revolutionibus », mais il s'agissait de la révolution des astres autour du Soleil, astres qui revenaient périodiquement, selon les cas, au même point. Les historiens des sciences se focalisent davantage sur la révolution scientifique des XVIIe, XVIIIe siècles. Et cela donne lieu à d'âpres débats pour savoir s'il y a vraiment eu, si on peut dire que c'était une révolution ou que ce n'était pas une révolution, d'âpres débats aussi virulents qu'à propos de la réforme grégorienne. Pour la période antérieure à l'âge moderne, sont plutôt évoquées, dans le domaine des sciences et de la culture en général, des renaissances. Mais ce terme aussi fait débat. Dans ce cadre, le XIe siècle n'est ni révolutionnaire, ni renaissant, mais il amorce des changements profonds. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup pour votre relation très riche, très intéressante. Veramente ringrazio molto per questo.
I would like to thank you for this really rich and dense presentation, and rich in information. It was anchored in data and very clear shapes. So it was a survey of the most significant stages of this meeting in the 11th century between the East and the West. Okay, let's go on. So going on in this session on dialectics, so very interesting is the part on the astrolabe, on the intersections between the world of science and medicine, and the importance of the Arabic culture and its mediation in the Western world. Thank you. Sincere help. So thank you also for your being on time. Let's now go on to the second speech. Claudia Storti from the University of Milan, who will report about imperial justice and School of Pavia. You have the floor.
Thank you. The title I chose corresponds exactly to what the organizing committee had proposed to me. Thinking back to imperial justice and to the so-called School of Pavia, in the light of the many researches now classic, more or less recent, is in fact indispensable to try to delineate some characters of the double track of justice of that century, of that represented by the Notitia Judicati of trials solemnly celebrated in the Placiti, held by the emperors or their delegates, and of that mostly unknown, which took place in the lower and local tribunals, known only thanks to the avant-garde research on surviving documents in some centers. I'm thinking of Padua Schioppa's on concerning Milan. On the one hand, therefore, imperial justice in matters of real estate nature, and in cases that mostly had as their object public goods and fiscal rights reserved for the few powerful holders of the fate of large territories and of the city and or rural populations concentrated in them, often pitted against each other, also for political reasons or for mere aspiration to enlarge their areas of power. A justice that was, so to speak, not moving in a form of placiti carried out secundum leges, with the supervision of authoritative and wise judges and court notaries, by the emperors, by their missi, and at most, according to the same model, by dukes, marquises, counts, those of Canossa, Milan, and Veneto, for example, and in a few cases also by bishops, recipients of the concession of jurisdictional powers. On the other hand, criminal and civil justice for most administered in the courts of the kingdom's hierarchically inferior judges, such as Gastaldi and Sculdasci, with the assistance, in turn, of judges and notaries aspiring to career advancement, and justice attested by the Liber Papiensis, so to say, the collection of the kingdom's laws from Rotary to 1054, as well as glosses, formulas, and debate of their interpretation that goes by the name of expositio. In all these major and minor courts, there were legal experts, notaries and judges who advised on how to proceed and how to judge to those who had the power to pronounce judgment on their activity. Since the Longobards era, kings and emperors had produced a strict legislation to guarantee not only the impartiality of the judging bodies, but also the regularity of the procedures and the correctness of the choice of lex in the decision when the different laws applied in the kingdom, according to the nationality of the parties involved, had provided for different treatments. This in order to avoid the contamination of legislative solutions with customary ones, and also with those of the canonical process that was being defined and growing, we heard this yesterday, to the development of which the concessions of jurisdiction made to bishops and in some cases also to abbots and abbesses certainly contributed. My intervention must, however, and first and foremost, be an attempt to survey and coordinate the state of knowledge on justice in the 11th century. The task is extremely arduous if one considers the never-ending torment of historiography between past and present on a century that, in addition to the many very important sources that have handed down some salient traits, has also left us many silences, so to say. Documents that have disappeared, if only, but we will return to this due to the destruction of entire archives. The starting point of this paper cannot be but the proceedings of the 1996 Spoleto Week on Justice in the early Middle Ages in the 9th, 11th centuries. That conference constituted an important stage of re-examination and reflection on many authoritative early studies such as those of Padua Schioppa, Bogart, Wickham, De Logu, Sergi, Nicolai Redding, and the starting point for studies over the last 20 years. These problems are, at least in my opinion, only apparently formal, as they end up more or less involving the nature of institutions, relations between powers, trust in those who exercise judicial functions, and the trust of the latter in the governed one. As it has been explored in these days, the 11th century is a difficult century to recount in a unified manner because it takes on different connotations as the intersections between different fields and specialization of historical research are established, and the different phases of its development are being focused on. In time, the characteristics of the distinct areas into which Italy was divided, as well as finally the subjects involved in the individual events. Not only monastic and ecclesiastical centers, often with a clash involved in the individual events, not only monastic and ecclesiastical centers, but also communities, sometimes rural and more frequently townships with their elites, nobles, judges, lawyers, notaries, also often landowners who, curiously enough, never appear as parties in conflict subject to imperial rulings. Merchants who were already striving towards the end of the 10th centuries, in some places to control the ports on the Great River, such as the Po and the Adige, and then to open colonies, settling up colonies in the Mediterranean. Think of the Venetians and the Pisans in the second half of the 11th century to increase wealth, the social mobility, in short, the new intensity of also denounced by the writings of personalities of the level of Ottone of Vercelli, Liutprand of Cremona, and Raterio of Verona. This, due to the crisis caused in the decades of the kingdom by its mismanagement. The reassuring image of the compactness and wisdom of imperial justice, celebrated in the Lxxi with the continuous reference to the lex and the legal judicium appears, however, to be distant from the progressive differentiation and or rarefaction of the intensity of its control over the Italian territory through the creation of juridical spaces qualified by a special juridical or jurisdictional regime. Suffice to say, or to recall, how the qualification or requalification of special juridical spaces in the empire consisted firstly in bringing of lands communities subject to concessions to ecclesiastical, monastic, and finally even city authorities under the direct protection of him and his court through the exclusion of the intermediation of the judicial and administrative powers of all the lower ranks of the kingdom's hierarchy, dukes, counts, bishops, Gastaldis, Sculdasci. Protection granted not only to bishops and monasteries in the 11th century, but also to cities, for example, Cremona in 1037, Pisa and Lucca in 1081. These concessions grew over a number of territories that were often strategically, or to use a topical term, geopolitical, very important. The empire ended up by taking direct control of entire territories in exchange for alliances or in order to solve problems which we might define of public order. Think about clashes between bishops and which have often been cited. What the empire retained was instead an external control, so to speak, through the guarantee of its protection to the concessionaries in the event of violation of its precepta. And in the 11th century, this took place, first of all, with the imposition of the bannum in a public trial. We have heard about this even in the lecture, another lecture. So the bannum in a public trial in which the court established that any future perpetrators of attacks against the integrity of the conceded goods would have to pay huge amounts of gold, good, excellent, or very pure, half to the imperial chamber and half to the offended part. The institution of the bannum was not new, since he had already been introduced in Charlemagne's capitulars, but from roughly the third decade of the 11th century, the bannum clause was replaced by the Lombard compositio, which had been normally used in diplomas until then. This was done in order to accentuate the criminalistic connotation of the liability of those who had attacked the enjoyment of goods and rights, as such actions ended up being fully equated to crimes against the general order and public peace of the kingdom and empire. The judicial placitums, of which we have heard, constituted, as noted, an occasion not only to settle disputes in the strict sense, but also to bring the subjects closer to the power and convince them of its impartiality in the exercise of justice as the supreme function of government, of which the emperor was the older and the highest guardian. Before the eyes and judgment, not only of the members of the upper classes, but also of the populace, in particular the boni homines, who were sometimes called upon to ascertain the truth of the facts through the inquisitio proceedings or testimony in highly controversial cases, the guarantee of the impartiality of public justice and the correct application of the law was moreover ensured by the large number of notaries and palace judges of notaries and lawyers who had become judices, and of judices who had become judices sacri palazzi, as well as, at least from the mid-11th century onwards, some legum doctor in the judging court. The majesty of the political power whose task it was to pronounce judgment was flanked in a sort of game of the parts by the wisdom of the technicians who stood out among the many bystanders for their knowledge of the laws. All the records of imperial placeti that have come down to us concern disputes concerning the ownership of real estate, lands, and communities residing, living in them, and not infrequently of public rights. The function of these trials is often that of putting an end to episodes of violence already in progress, or whose occurrence can be foreseen, and to prevent them from arising again. The structure of placeti depends on the nature of the evidence that those requesting the court's intervention have at their disposal to prove the legitimacy of their ownership of goods and rights. As is well known, these were cases that from the end of the 9th century and until the early decades of the 12th were settled by formalized procedures. I will return to them shortly, and this formalism raised debates on the nature of imperial placites. Were they mock trials or real adversarial judgments? We have records of these in the 1996 writings. From my point of view, albeit very succinctly, the judgments received show that the procedure was in any case adversarial, and albeit not in very many cases using evidentiary procedures. We can summarize it like this. After the appearance before the court of the party, the emperor or the imperial missus, or in any case the president of the court, would ask the judges how to proceed. On the basis of the judge's advice, the opposing party would be sued, perhaps with the setting of one or more terms on different days. At this point, different situations arose. If the defendant appeared, he was asked to present his defense with evidence. If he did not appear, the plaintiff argued that he had repeatedly asked the judge to summon him to court, and in these cases, it was the presiding judge or judges who intervened to confirm the truth of the plaintiff's claim. Finally, again, the president of the court would ask the judges for advice. Judges and sometimes auditores would formulate their opinion. The president of the court would take note of their consilium or judicum judicium and pronounce a confirming sentence, asking at the same time the notary to write the carta that would serve both to confer by publicity the firmitas of the solution to the dispute, and possibly to be presented ostensa, using the placeti words, in a future court case. Depending on the nature of the available evidence and the attitude of the defendant, four distinct forms of procedure were adopted, which reproduce verbatim, even in the use of certain terms, four of the hypotheses included in the text published in the volume of the Leges Langobardorum under the title of Chartularium. Historiography has also been much debating on this text, and not on the dating, which is unanimously dated to the Ottonian era, nor on the fact that only judges could have invented those formulas, but on the place of origin and the center of production. Judges or notaries who merely attested the practice Who knows, in the future somebody might have an answer to this question. When disputes were easy to prove, as a party could prove with written documents its ownership or disputed property, or the exact delimitation of its boundaries, the procedure adopted was that of ostensio carte. It consisted in presenting to the trying court a notarial deed attesting the ownership of certain assets by donation or will or purchase, or by a recent confirmation of imperial diplomas, perhaps very old, and or in certain cases published on recent confirmation of imperial diplomas. Perhaps, in certain cases, published on the same day as the trial, and of which, even despite a possible derivation from a public authority, they wish to give either the maximum publicity or to obtain the waiver in court by possible litigants. On a closer inspection, the ostensio procedure had already been thought of by the Lombard king Liuprando in 729. At least for some hypotheses, as is well known, in the 8th as still in the 11th century, notaries did not have the power to confer publica fides on their writings, something that only happened between the 12th and 13th centuries, as Liutprand himself had already established the firmitas of certain notarial acts, first and foremost those of last will, could only be obtained by ostensio to a judge or a bishop or a public official. Giving notizia of a document served the purpose of preventing silence from falling on it, and this silence was used to prevent the older from losing his rights, which in fact already happened several times in previous centuries. In other cases, however, written proof of the ownership of the disputed property was missing when private carte or diplomas had been destroyed or lost or stolen, as we can read in the Lxxi. Or maybe the documents had never been written, and this is our hypothesis, because the legitimacy of the occupation or acquisition of land, whether dating back in time or occurring modern tempore, had never been budded with evidence, perhaps because no one had perceived the value or strategic importance of those assets until a certain moment. The reason for the dispute, however, could still have been different, and it is useful to dwell on this in order to understand the possible dynamics underlying this imperial placity and to try to guess the reasons why the notizie were so succinct, while probably the cross-examination between the parties had been very intense, either in the judgment itself or before or on the sidelines of it. Think of the case of counterfeit or forged papers, or the consequence of negotiations in which one party had been the victim of circumvention or extortion per vim, or where there were conflicting carte, in the noting that even where carte existed, they often left endless and were the occasion of conflicts and unrest of the consistency of the ceded, and often they left endless uncertainties and were the occasions of conflict and unrest over the consistency of the ceded and acquired property, if only with regard to the definition of boundaries.
Intraprendere la via di un legale
Embarking on the path of a legal judicium to obtain certainty as to the exact consistency of an estate implied in many cases making a prior probability calculation as to the consistency and the soundness of the evidence one believed to be available. The same calculation would have had to be made by the defendant, or the one who, even if not a defendant, had subsequently decided to appear in court to resist, perhaps even to an ostensio carte. It is true that of all this, little or nothing emerges from the Notizie Iudicati, but it appears, on the other hand, clearly from the formulae linked to the laws and the Liber Papiensis, by which the proceedings began in the formula. So it read how it should have started. Petre te appellat Martinos, for instance. This is one of the formulas. So the reading made clear with his writings. Always different formulas depending on the content of the provisions of the many royal and imperial laws precisely on property and possession. It cannot be excluded, indeed, perhaps it is probable, that this exchange of issues took place before notaries and/or judges before the trial began, with the solemn entrance into the courtroom of the president, and that either an emperor or the missi, and that at least in certain cases judges and notaries were the same ones who would assist the party or the parties until the pronouncement of the sentence. Calculations and predictions of which no trace has been left in the Notizie Iudicati, but which were handed down instead for the 11th century by the formulae to the Liber Papiensis, and for the 12th century by the trials, written trials with the elaboration and writing of the so-called positiones. That is to say, the exchange of questions and answers between the parties prior to the commencement, to the start of the action. So having said this, in the case of doubt, and here we are mentioning the other formulas, in the case of doubt as to the existence of a notarial deed, the finis intentionis terrae took place in adversarial proceedings when the disputant of the property at the request of the person who, although not presenting any deed, claimed to be the owner, appeared at trial without being able to present in turn contrary and irrefutable written evidence, and therefore expressly renounced the challenge, promising that in future, if he had the evidence to claim his ownership and return into the possession of those goods, or possibly to alienate them, so this was written in the formulas, he would have paid the value or double the value of the property, and in addition a penalty. If then, although the plaintiff lacked written proof, the litigant summoned several times, who had perhaps occupied the property by force or had harassed the occupier, so in the case they did not show up or refused to show up, the trial ended in the plaintiff's favor with the investiture salva querela, which consisted in the assignment not of ownership rights, but of the possession of property, until the litigant decided to initiate, to start a legal judicium to regain possession of it. There is a placitum of the year 1046, which is very interesting, with the bishop as the main protagonist. So in the cartularium, it was foreseen as an integral part of the saving investiture procedure that the plaintiffs would request the imposition of the bannum, already mentioned, a bannum against those, the current opponent or his heirs and other representatives who had been willing to resort to the de facto solution instead of acting before a judge. As already noted, moreover, the bannum could be requested autonomously from the judges in a real trial, with the claimants declaring that they held the ownership of a property that was, so to speak, questionable. They did not produce any documents, but declared that they were ready to support their reasons in future judgments against anyone who wanted to challenge their right to property. They said, parati sumus in judicio standum et legitime fine precipiendum, against any magna parvaque persona who could not be excluded, who, according to allegations, would have presented himself. So perhaps precisely because there was an awareness that something was not exactly right in the acquisition of possessions of this estate. We'll now skip the whole part about the system of evidence because of time constraints. And I would like now to speak about the last part. The crisis of the Placiti, attested by the disappearance of notizie iudicati in the last years of the 11th century, can be put into a comparison with the intensification, well documented in the same period, of the recourse to arbitration and compromises, sometimes called lodi, in which a clause was inserted at the end, by which the parties undertook not to never provoke a legal judicium anymore. So some of these lodi even had a constitutional value, such as those celebrated in Pisa in the last decade of the 11th century. So they are also considered constitutional and are considered among the first foundations of the city freedom. At the same time, the progressive liberation of entire territories from the rule of justice of the authorities of the kingdom and the empire occurred throughout the 11th century with the creation of a special juridical spaces excluded from the control of the administrative and judicial authorities of the regnum and subjected instead to local ecclesiastical or lay authorities, mostly established in the cities. In the cities, parties, factions were sharpening their weapons to gain full control with the local government, and this also corresponded to the elaboration of increasingly differentiated local practices, which in international cities, so important international cities, suffice to mention Genoa, Pisa, Milan, would lead between the 12th century and the early 13th century to the written drafting of entirely local and original procedural rules with the formulas already mentioned, the sort of repudiation of the legality or lawfulness that had been proclaimed, at least in words, by the empire. And as we shall see, had also conditioned the judges for at least half the century, and also the judges of the so-called Pavia school. So I know that the term legality is, so to speak, provocative and is inspired by the fact that the paradigm sicut lex iubet, already tested in the middle of the 9th century in the Liber Legis Langobardorum Concordia Dictus, lasted a very long time. Until the last decade of the 11th century, in the language of diplomas and imperial placiti, as well as in many private documents. Let us not forget that since the Langobard age, it was precisely and only the violation of the lex by the side of the judges that was a cause for the justification of dissent and even rebellion. So Liutprand had foreseen this development, and the principle remained constant even in the implementation of the discipline, envisaged by Rakis and many later subsequent legislators, in provisions that were widely interpreted and discussed throughout the 11th century, as proven by the Expositio ad Librum Papiensem. So we're talking about legitimate or lawful rebellion due to the breach of laws. In the diplomas, the concession to judge secundum legale judicium was in contrast with the concession to judge secundum consuetudines, allowed in very exceptional cases. And I also found a diploma dating back to the year 1001, diploma to the Bishop of Vicenza. It is only towards the end of the 11th century that we see in diplomas the explicit concession to derogate from the so-called leges. Suffice it to think of a diploma by Henry IV for the peasants in 1081 that concerns precisely rules relating to trials, as well as the recognition of the customs, the consuetudines. The primacy of the law also seems to be affirmed by the characteristics of the interpretation of the Antiqui Judices, attested by the exposition ad Librum Papiensem. The activity may date back to the time between the last years of the 10th century and the middle of the 11th century, and the tendency repeatedly pointed out by historiography was to ensure the literal application of the leges collected in the Liber Papiensis. According to this tendency of the Antiqui Judices, in the case of conflict between laws, it had to be established whether and how, that is to say, whether all or part of it, a later law had abrogated, rompit is the verb, an earlier law. And this continued to be the case throughout the first half of the 11th century, even when it was a matter of contrast between laws of the kingdom and the empire, Liber Papiensis, and the Lex Romana, applicable no longer only in certain cases on the basis of the principle of nationality, but because the Lex Romana, according to a famous expression, was Lex Generalis Omnium. So to fill the gaps of the local legislation. So the reality of the system of sources was indeed very complex, as proven by a small treatise that goes by the name of Placiti Forma Glossata, that certainly concerns judicial practice and could be thought of as having been used maybe to train new jurists,
Attraverso simulazioni, li chiameremmo test,
or to verify through simulation tests the learning of the law by aspiring judges or lawyers. There were questiones collected in these booklets, theoretically posed to adjudicating bodies, the card or judges, to indicate according to which rule of law a person could, for example, claim the full enjoyment of a right, or ask to provide evidence in card. And this is just an example. In the answers, moreover, and this is the sign of so-called modern times, one finds many references not only to the laws collected in the Liber Papiensis, but also to the usus, for instance, on a testimony in court, on witness in court, or to what we might call the customary interpretation of law, what they used to call usus et exemplo. So the usus and the customary interpretation were interpreted as the leges Longobarde or those leges Romane that had never disappeared completely, albeit perhaps in a vulgarized tradition, and indeed had caused a contamination between rights. So I'm now coming to the last chapter. For decades, in-depth research, so the last topic I will deal with is the Pavia School and the Expositio ad Librum Papiensem. For decades, in-depth research has been devoted to the Expositio ad Librum Papiensem and to, so to speak, minor legal writings I have already referred to which reference has already been made in an attempt to ascertain not only their dating and function, that is to say, whether they were intended for the training of technicians or for practice purposes, but also the place where they were written, where they were drafted. Some historians have identified it in Pavia, others have not. But as Padoa-Schioppa pointed out, while reasons used to exclude Pavia do not appear well-founded, neither do exist certain elements to affirm it. Pavia was nonetheless one of the most important cities in the kingdom back in those times. Suffice it to mention that Pavia was the seat for the celebration of the Placiti, of the imperial Placiti, 1039, 1043, 1051, and 1077, and councils in 1046, 1049, 1076, and 1081. Kings and emperors stayed here during their Italian itineraries. Henry IV 5 times between his coronation and the gathering of an army against Gregory VII. Pavia retained its role also as a center of public administration, with the continuity of the mint and the collection of tax duties. Its citizens were also called upon to hold top-level posts in other important Italian cities, Let's just think of the two bishops of Florence and Pisa in the second half of the century. So with so many characteristics and prerogatives, Pavia could not but be a very important judicial seat or a center of judicial power, as well as the seat of debates between judges who were certainly from Pavia, at times identifiable with imperial judges, such as can be reconstructed on the basis of the Expositio ad Librum Papiensem reports. So in short, although not the only one, Pavia certainly continued to be a center of culture and legal education in the 11th century, as proven by the studies of Antonio Padua Schioppa, Giampaolo Massetto, and Charles Redding. The fact that the Expositio was a text to train jurists is undoubted, and neither is it in doubt that it was a text drafted by a person who had a profound knowledge of all the problems that not only notaries, notary publics, and lawyers in assisting their clients were faced, but also judges and lawyers every day in courtrooms. So then, as well as now, the important thing for a legal practitioner, as well as for a teacher, was and still is to know what the most debated issues were and are, and perhaps even whether a communis opinio had formed in the school or in the adjudicating courts in the form of previous uso et exemplo on highly controversial issues. And the disputes, as time went by, became more and more complex in this century, the more they shifted from the literal interpretation of the antiqui judices to the interpretation of the modern people. The latter, by examining the spirit of each law and not to the literal aspects of the laws, contributed to broadening or narrowing its application with interpretation techniques such as distinctiones, argumenta questiones, whether practical or theoretical or scholastic, that is, with the techniques of interpretation, which eventually also characterized the study of Roman law in Bologna. Legum doctrina adjuatur judiciaria cognitio can be read in the gloss to the institutions attributed to another protagonist of the disputes of the Expositio, namely Valcausus or Valcosius, probably from Pavia, and certainly Ludex Sacri Palazzi, perhaps active between 1055 and 1079, whose gloss to Justinian's institutiones had also been studied in depth by Redding, who also nominated him as one of the possible authors of the Expositio itself. The fact that everything reported by the Expositio, all the disputes took place in Pavia or not, however, is not certain, since several schools of law, as well as of liberal arts, are attested for the 11th century in the Lombard area. Suffice to think of Vercelli and Mantua and Pisa immediately afterwards. Even if, in the current state of knowledge, it is in many cases difficult to verify whether there were liberal arts schools or specialized schools attached to the courts of justice. It cannot be ruled out that the expositor was himself one of the many judges, traveling judges or legal practitioners that he had collected and unified in a single text opinions and debates that had taken place in study centers and courtrooms in different centers or different cities. If we take into account the significant mobility of the great personalities of the 11th century, the thirst for knowledge and experience, the circulation of ideas and doctrines, the aspirations for career advancement, and the legal professions of many of them, I actually do not think we can exclude the possibility that their educational background and that of the idea of their conception of law may have taken place by traveling, even progressively into different locations, depending on the opportunities offered from place to place in specific fields of cultural debate, and the search for practical solutions for an improvement of society, and in the attempt to ensure, via the law, that Pax et Concordia, that would represent the dominant theme of so many legislative innovations implemented in the 12th century cities. the decisive, the most important phase of the transition from a Longobards-based source system to Romanist-based system indeed took place with the Bologna School, to the foundation of which, moreover, great imperial judges had contributed, from Pepo to Irnerius, and political protagonists of the late 11th century, such as the important role had by Matilda di Canossa, the antagonist of Emperor Henry IV. Thanks for your attention.
Grazie per questo splendido affresco così.
Thanks for this wonderful fresco and this dense exposition touching on so many topics. So imperial justice, as opposed to justice administered by lower categories of figures, they look into procedures and notary publics. And in particular, I found it particularly interesting when you mentioned the creation of a special juridical spaces or areas that then led to different areas in different cities. Thanks to Claudia Storti. We will now have our 15 minutes break, after which we will resume our activities at 5:15. Thanks for being on time again. So see you in 15 minutes' time.
Eccoci giunti alla terza lezione del pomeriggio.
Welcome back for the third lecture of this afternoon in the chapter History and Settlement of Rights. And I would like to introduce to you Professor Brasington of the West Texas University, who will speak about the topic Pro Nostra Ecclesia Necessitate Fecerim, canonical collections from Borchardt of Worms to Ivo of Chartres, continuities, challenges, opportunities.
Thank you very much indeed. It is a great honor to be here. I thank the Institute and the Scientific Committee for the kind invitation to come, and also the staff, all the hard-working people who make this conference possible, and also the translators who work so hard. So thank you very much indeed. I also want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Cushing, for example, for sharing their advice with me in research. And I also want to take this brief moment to express my particular debt to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Martin Brett of Cambridge, and the late Professor Dr. Peter Landau. I also have frequently relied on the Clavis Canonum database, hosted by the Monumenta Germaniae Historica. It was mentioned yesterday, in fact. It searches rubrics, inscriptions, incipits, and explicates across numerous collections, including Gratian's Decretum, and it plays a very important role in this talk. The most important continuity in research is the reevaluation of Paul Fournier's master narrative. More than a century ago, Fournier argued that reform, led by Pope Gregory VII, had renewed the canon law and turned it towards Rome. This view is increasingly challenged. Already in the 1980s, Professor Tellenbach had questioned whether reform had any clear meaning. Professor Gilchrist had noted the meager canonistic reception of Gregory VII's letters. Thanks to the Clavis database, we know now as well that compilers included more Carolingian texts than contemporary papal decretals and conciliar canons. The extant manuscripts also indicate the modest reception of Fournier's Gregorian collections. In some, we have come to view the curious influence on the canonical collections as less dramatic than Fournier had maintained. Recently, Professor David Davray has revived Fournier's 11th century turn, but pointing it towards late antique, not contemporary Rome. He argues that ancient papal decretals, augmented by patristic texts, some newly compiled, had provoked uncertainties. Their requirements for clerical celibacy and prohibition of lay interference in episcopal elections contrasted sharply with the political and social realities of the new millennium, and this may well have motivated reformers. For answers, they consulted these ancient decrees, which became more relevant in the course of the century. This was, in his words, demand-driven papal jurisprudence, end quote, not any response to a Roman initiative. While the Pseudo-Isidorian collections transmitted many texts, both authentic and forged, we also should not single out those overtly declaring Roman primacy, which was a key feature of Fournier's thesis. As Davray notes, it was the entire body of late antique papal rulings that met the demands of the compilers. Whether or not this becomes the new master narrative for 11th century canon law, scholars must consider his arguments. Granted, contemporary papal texts were not entirely absent in the 11th century collections. Indeed, their numbers grew by century's end. However, their inclusion generally reflected not any curial agenda, but rather local and regional concerns. As the title of my paper, a quote from Burkhard of Worms' preface declares, such necessities guided the compiler's selections. Our attention to these decisions, these concerns, these local concerns, now replaces Fournier's vertical model, whose apex was Rome, with a broader, more horizontal view towards the collection's users. Scholars also challenge Fournier's teleological assumption that canonistic jurisprudence in the 11th century helped to prepare the scholastic method. For example, they have reinterpreted Ivo of Chartres' prologue to the Decretum and the Panormia. And I should mention that while the latter, the Panormia, largely depended on Ivo's Decretum for sources, Professor Rolker has demonstrated that Ivo did not compile it. Now, the prologue remains a landmark text in canonistic jurisprudence, but less of a decisive step towards the scholastic method. Rather, it reflects Ivo's pastoral concerns. These, as Professor Austin has noted, also betray no causal link with the Roman reform. Like Burkhard of Worms on more shortly, pastoral discretion guided Ivo's judgment. After all, there was still no formal educational or normative institutional authority to follow. Nor did Ivo arrange the canons in an authoritative hierarchy or juxtapose them sic et non. This holistic view of the canons enabled him to interpret, apply, and limit by dispensation. While certainly familiar with the dialectic, Ivo did not apply it in his prologue, decretum, or letters. However, the dialectic may be implicit in the topical arrangement of the Panormia, and I shall consider this later. Of course, challenges abound. The collection's fundamental textual instability cannot be avoided. For this reason, among many, we lack modern critical editions, a rare exception being the collection in 74 titles. Burkhard remains trapped in the Patrologia Latina. Von Glanville's edition of De Aesthetis collection incorrectly reproduces the canon's numbering. Tanner's edition of Anselm of Lucas collection does not consider all versions. While the Collectio Farfensis is edited, the influential South Italian collection in 5 books remains incomplete. And these are just a few examples. Nevertheless, there are also opportunities. A promising initiative is implicit additions. These list inscriptions, incipits, and explicits, and sources are also identified. 2 examples are the Burkhard derivative Collectio Bertigolensis and the South Italian Collectio Canonum Duodecimi Seculi, which is derived from the collection in 5 books. While complete critical editions remain the goal, such studies assist our exploration of the canon law's local and regional dissemination. The internet also facilitates editorial projects. In addition to the Clavis Canonum, other valuable additions include Professor Fiery's Carolingian Canon Law Project. A digital Burkhard project is underway at the University of Kassel. And for more than 30 years, Dr. Brett has led a project to edit the Evonian Decretum and the Pseudo-Evonian Panormia. He also provides a provisional editio princeps of the Tripartita, a key source for Ivo's Decretum. Now, while the edition of the Panormia is less complete, many of its more than 140 manuscripts have been fully or partially collated. And this is a great improvement over the handful behind the edition in Mean. Brett also provides tables showing additions and omissions in manuscripts. And he also includes appendices found in various manuscripts. And more on these later in the conclusion to my talk. Here again, the Clavis Canonum has identified both material and formal sources. And these reveal how the Evonian orbit collections relate to other northern French compilations. Brett's project has uncovered not Lachmanian stemmas, but instead interwoven tapestries of canons shared in various forms across collections. And this also holds true for the majority of the 11th century collections, where each manuscript is, as Dr. Brett puts it, a book of use. Added or omitted canons indicate varying local demand and necessity. Now, time unfortunately prevents discussion of many important collections. For example, the German collection in 12 parts from Freising. The same is true for Aquitanian and Catalonian collections, such as the Liber Tarraconensis. Though I note that we can no longer support Fournier's contention that these came from a legal school at Poitiers. I cannot consider Lanfranc-Beck's collection. I cannot treat individual Ferruginus collections, diverse dossiers that fortunately have received increasing scholarly attention, and they do deserve a brief comment. Often, unfortunately, labeled as minor. They are anything but minor. They help us trace the horizontal spread of the canons. They also may have been drafts for larger collections or intermediaries among them. And this could, in fact, explain the often shared but differing readings of texts among canonical collections. Any compiler could have drawn from multiple dossiers. This challenges Fournier's contention that single, now lost, intermediate collections had been the source for many of his reform compilations. So now we turn to the beginning of the 11th century to Burchard of Worms Decretum. It reflects the bishop's pastoral concerns. These guided how he selected and sometimes altered canons. Even his choice of the canon beginning a book was very intentional. It set the theme. And this again is also true for later collections, for example, Evos Decretum. Some years ago, Professor Landau noted that Burchard employed biblical principles when changing the canon law's commands on marriage between the free and unfree. More recently, Professor Austin has emphasized the degree to which Burchard eliminated contradictions between canons and changed rubrics to alter their meaning. This reflected, as his preface declared, his concern to select authoritative canons. And this seems to have excluded secular legislation. He even periodically changed inscriptions to attribute text to sources he may have considered more authoritative. Now, some of Burchard's interventions in the canons were significant. He altered a canon to extend the penance, originally reserved to homicide, now to death from a feud, and this shaped subsequent canon law. It also demonstrates the increasing blend of penitential and canonical collection. Another innovation appears in Book 7 of the Decretum, where he established a 7th degree of marriage prohibition. Scholars have long noted the Decretum's popularity in Italy. Most copies also come from episcopal libraries, despite his preface declaring the Decretum should not leave his diocese. Scholars have also paid closer attention to the Decretum's transmission with other canonistic works. For example, the Italian collection in 5 books, and dossiers of liturgical and penitential texts. Such interest in how collections were bundled with other works has been a trend for some time in research and offers many opportunities for further study. Derivative versions also transformed it. For example, the monastic revision in the French Collectio Bertigolensis I just mentioned a moment ago. The collection in 17 books, likely from Saint-Hilaire and Poitiers, later updated Burchard's Decretum with 2 decretals from Pope Alexander II and added canons on simony. And these, again, are just a few examples. Such updating of Burchard with later papal decretals challenges Fournier's assertion that Gregorian reformers avoided this collection. There is no evidence that political allegiance, to quote Professor Roker, determined the choice of a formal source. This applies more generally to other texts and collections in the 11th century and calls into question another label, Gregorian. By way of further illustration, almost all of Fournier's classic Gregorian compilations did not include the decisive 1059 papal election decree, and this included the collection of Cardinal Deusdedit. More on him in a moment. The famous prohibitions of lay investiture often appear only in single manuscripts. Even the unusual presence of the Dictatus Papae in the Aquitanian Catalonian Liber Tarraconensis may reflect regional interests and networks of communication, for example, among bishops, and not particular allegiance to Gregory VII or the Roman Reform. Glosses and marginalia also provide opportunities for research. While far fewer than those that would gather around Gratian in the next century, glosses do appear from time to time in the 11th century collections. For example, in Freiburg, Universitätsbibliothek 7, a manuscript of Burckhardt copied at Constance. The extensive glosses, mostly lexical, to the collection in 5 books, invite further study. Notomarks are worth exploring. For example, those preserved in the Freiburg manuscript of Burckhardt I just mentioned. Inspired by Dr. Gulick's study of marginal signs in a manuscript of Lanfranc's collection, I am currently studying these notomarks as evidence of readership. Another remarkable example of marginalia has been examined by Professor Dussel. Neumes in manuscripts of Burckhardt's Decretum. He has suggested that a priest may have sung particular canons to instruct his audience. In sum, marginalia help us better understand the local demand for and use of the canon law. We turn now to monastic collections. As Professor Cushing reminds us, quote, monks and abbots, after all, needed canon law quite as much as bishops and other clergy, end quote. However, we again should avoid attributions of allegiance. The monastic orientation of the Collectio Farfensis does not, as Fournier maintained, indicate opposition to bishops. Nor can we simply assign a Gregorian allegiance to the monastic collection in 74 titles, perhaps Fournier's quintessential papal reform collection. Its concern was not primacy, but how papal privileges granted to monasteries freed them from episcopal control. The compiler of 74 titles also manipulated canons to this effect. A letter of Pope Leo the Great, JK 481, granting privileges to churches, was now extended to include monasteries. Devoting an entire title to monastic liberty was also unprecedented. Such innovations made 74 titles popular in monastic networks as a formal source for other collections. The Clavis Canonum shows the influence of the South Italian collection in 5 books on other compilations, among them 74 titles. Its many derivative versions also remind us that the number of extant manuscripts of the original collection may not always measure its influence. The 74 titles' emphasis on clerical celibacy and degrees of consanguinity attracted later compilers who drew these texts from it. Now we move to Rome. The collection of Cardinal Deusdedit has received increasing scholarly attention in recent decades. While we have long known that it shared Pseudo-Isidorian texts with Anselm of Lucca, it nevertheless again cannot be simply labeled Gregorian. While deeply respectful of the papacy and far more concerned with papal jurisdiction and administration than Burckhardt decades earlier, Deusdedit focused on the privileges and prerogatives of the lesser Roman clergy against the cardinals. Not surprisingly, these included concerns about property, defense of property rights, a topic that audiences far from the Curia would also appreciate. Manuscripts from France and Catalonia indicate as well that Deus Dedit's Roman orientation was not so extreme as to alienate compilers further afield. They simply omitted some of the Rome-specific material. Gregorian is no less problematic when applied to the collection of Anselm of Lucca. Certainly the earliest version of Anselm's collection, version A, is more overtly papally oriented, indeed polemical, than other Reformed collections designated by Fournier. But other versions of Anselm's collection took different paths. They were books of use. Dr. Cushing has studied a very good example, the BB version of Anselm, Biblioteca Apostolica Barberini, 535, likely produced at the canonry of San Frediano in the early 12th century. It modified Anselm to reflect local needs. Like the A version, it still honored Pope Gregory VII, but its concerns were more practical. For example, added canons treat the preservation of property and the concerns of regular clergy. Scholars have also begun to consider more how the collection was transmitted. Dr. Cushing has noted the location of San Frediano along the Via Francigena. This heeds the late Dr. Fowler Moggerell's call, her suggestion, that we pay greater attention to manuscripts copied along this road and other pilgrimage routes. I might add that the Paris Basin Project, undertaken by Professors Fiery and Eichbauer, is currently mapping the movement of other canonistic manuscripts along the pilgrimage route's northern section, which is on this slide. You can see it, I think, fairly well. Thus, instead of searching for fixed schools of legal study, it may sometimes be better to follow such lines of communication and transport. Proximity to a major road may have been decisive in the success of compilations like Anselm's. Monasteries and houses of regular canons provided thoroughfares for intellectual exchanges, where copying took place and codices passed along, sometimes without any trace of local study. We turn now to France and the confusingly named Collectio Britannica. Scholars recognize its significance in transmitting papal letters and Roman law texts, largely absent in earlier collections. While these texts and the Britannica's dependence on Deus Dedit point towards Italy, recent scholarship, again facilitated by the Clavis Canonum, reveals that its compiler also drew upon French sources, for example, Higmar of Reims. And thus, the collection in its present form may have been compiled north of the Loire around 1090. And now, the collections connected to Ivo of Chartres. The Tripartita provides an excellent example of textual instability. It drew upon the Britannica and the Collectio Brugensis. The latter collection furnished not only Pseudo-Isidorian texts, but also a prologue the Tripartita's compiler then modified. The first two sections of the Tripartita, A1 and A2, largely drew upon papal letters, including those from Urban II, an interest in contemporary popes not found earlier in the century. And it also drew upon conciliar canons. These two sections, A1 and A2, then furnished canons to the Evonian Decretum. A third section, B, abbreviates a finished Evonian Decretum. It remains It remains unclear, however, when the sections were united. There is no clear evidence from citations in Ivo's letters whether they came from the B section or his decretum. And finally, only one manuscript has surfaced where the A and B sections are independent, even though Ivo, or more likely someone associated with him, must have had access to A1 and A2 for the decretum. Textual instability. Professor Rolker has demonstrated that Ivo's decretum likely originated in Ivo's compilation of patristic texts during the Eucharistic controversy between Berengar of Tours and Lanfranc. These texts' later inclusion, along with canons from the Fathers on the sacraments, marriage, and other subjects, would influence later collections. Now, while scholars have long recognized Burckhardt, along with the Tripartita, as an important formal source for the decretum, research shows that the first Arsenal collection, Paris Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal 713, also contributed texts. Indeed, the first Arsenal collection may have been the last stage in the preparation of Ivo's decretum. Like Burckhardt, Ivo's method of compilation was very intentional. He paid particular attention to the canons selected to begin each book of the decretum. He then typically placed Burckhardt's canons in their center, with canons from the Arsenal collection around them to form a sandwich cluster. He eliminated duplicate canons very carefully, which is something we often find in earlier compilations. Ivo also, like Burckhardt and other compilers, did not hesitate to intervene in his sources. Commenting on the decretum's canons on marriage, Professor Rolker notes that Ivo was, quote, willing to select, abbreviate, and even alter ancient laws, end quote. Despite dependence on Burckhardt for both content and structure, Ivo's decretum also differs in important ways. Burckhardt's decretum, its first book, began with the visible church. For example, episcopal ordination. Ivo chose instead sacramental theology. To Professor Rolker, this sacramentalization of canon law reveals Ivo's implicit ecclesiology, a focus on the sacraments. Another divergence from Burckhardt concerns secular law. Unlike Burckhardt, Ivo did not avoid it. We have secular law, we have Roman law. Ivo also took patristic texts from original sources, not from earlier canonical collections. There are other interesting aspects to Ivo's method. He included canons on the authenticity and authority of texts in the 4th and 5th books. Compiling in the 1090s in the wake of the Eucharistic controversy and the investiture contest, this concern for authority likely reflected the fact that one could no longer simply compile authorities, compile sources. One needed a strong argument, a valid argument, an authoritative argument. However, like Burckhardt and earlier 11th century compilers, Ivo still left that argument to his reader, who could choose from a variety of texts. As noted earlier, Ivo did not harmonize contradictions. Whatever the reader might interpret and argue from his decretum, the only rule, as Ivo's prologue declared, was charity. Despite his few manuscripts, Ivo's decretum was influential. English readers were particularly interested. A version of Lanfranc's collection, for example, contains excerpts. I am currently analyzing an interesting example of the decretum's use. A reworked version preserved in Freiburg, Universitätsbibliothek B, fragment 53. Of uncertain provenance, it dates to the mid-12th century. Its unique, rearranged selection of canons from Book 9 of Ivos Decretum, the book which treats sexual relations and marriage. Its unique, rearranged selection creates a compilation on sexual purity. We turn now to the Panormia. It is comprehensive, with almost 1,200 canons in 8 books. Professor Rolker judges it more suited for study than application in court. And in fact, most of its canons are brief, far shorter than what you find in the Evonian Decretum. And perhaps their general brevity also reflects a pedagogical orientation. And this certainly differs, as I've just said, from Ivos Decretum. Filled with diverse texts, from Roman law to the Fathers, many canons newly compiled, the Panormia's messiness, to quote Professor Austin, typifies the horizontal, diverse, user-oriented canon law I have noted throughout this lecture. Fournier had numbered the Panormia among his Reform collections. This assertion must be qualified. Like other Northern French collections, it did not transmit the famous papal prohibitions of lay investiture. On the other hand, it does include the 1059 papal election decree, which rarely appeared in Northern France, and as noted earlier, is absent in De Aesthetet. In fact, the election decree opens the 3rd book of the Panormia, indicating that the compiler found it important. However, this may not reflect allegiance towards Rome or the memory of popes such as Nicholas II. Instead, perhaps its inclusion was due to the Panormia's later date and distance from the Curia. And these may have simply made the text more important but less partisan. Since the Panormia was compiled sometime around 1100 or shortly before, this may also be an indication of papal jurisdictional primacy, a greater concern for papal jurisdictional primacy. And Professor Dussel has noted growing interest in this as we move towards the 12th century. And this certainly is a strong contrast with the days of Burckhardt's Decretum. And this growing concern for papal jurisdictional primacy may have also been the reason why its compiler included not only the papal election decree, but also more recent legislation by Pope Urban II, for example, on celibacy. The Clavis Canonum has highlighted other differences from the Evonian Decretum. For example, the Panormia omits many of Ivo's rubrics in the Decretum, particularly those he had taken from Burckhardt. Perhaps the compiler of the Panormia found Burckhardt's text a bit suspect. The opening texts in the Decretum's books, noted earlier as indicative of Ivo's method, also do not occupy a similar place in the Panormia. Instead, the Panormia's compiler chose material from other collections. Perhaps the most striking difference with Ivos Decretum, Siglum IP, is how it treated baptism. In Book 1, the compiler pairs a text from Augustine questioning the benefits of baptism if the child died with one from Isidore defending infant baptism. This is not the only place where contrasting canons suggest a pedagogical, perhaps an implicitly dialectical purpose. In fact, Professor Rolker argues that this was in fact an intentional juxtaposition of canons, indicating a concern to highlight, as he puts it, inconsistencies. A marked change from earlier compilers who added or dropped canons depending on their views. It is also notable that later rubrics even assigned Quaestio and Solutio to these canons. Quaestio, Solutio. And I shall return to these rubrics shortly in my conclusion. The Panormia's vast, diverse transmission demands the horizontal approach. As Professor Austin puts it, it is in fact best to think of panormias. And indeed, I think you can apply that plural to almost all 11th century canonical collections. Decreta, collectiones, and not single fixed entities. Dr. Brett's conspectus of added and omitted canons easily demonstrates this. And these varying sequences of added and omitted canons reveal, again, diverse interests and necessities. Equally revealing are the many appendices and manuscripts of the collection. They frequently appear in the manuscripts, but often have been overlooked. And if I might just add something that's not in my talk, when one consults the Patrologia Latina, one hardly begins to understand the full story of the Panormia's transition, because an overwhelming percentage of all the Panormia manuscripts have added canons. And they are fascinating. Again, they highlight the collection's development, its transformation as a book of use. And here's just one example. A manuscript, Siglum SC from St. Petersburg, Hermitage Latin 25. Copied at the Premonstratensian Abbey of Weissenau, its appendix excerpted canons from Gratian, including dicta, and added them to the earlier Panormia. And these canons all treat procedure, a topic of increasing interest in the canon law in the 12th century. And this appendix would have been useful for a religious house facing litigation. These appendices, sometimes extraordinarily varied, sometimes very thematically focused, they deserve further study. I conclude. In the making of the Middle Ages, Sir Richard Southern noted that the 11th century ecclesiastical reform might be better found in the provinces, not at Rome. This applies, I think, as well to the canon law. Let us not view the 11th century canon law solely through a papal or Roman lens. We should be suspicious of labels like Gregorian, and we should be very cautious about master narratives. Nevertheless, canon law did change during the century between Burckhardt and the Panormia. So what about Fournier's turning point? Perhaps we should consider the works connected to Ivo of Chartres, rather than any particular papal text or so-called Reform collection. Unlike Burckhardt, Ivo and his circle chose more patristic texts and secular law. The sacraments were featured far more prominently. While Burckhardt's preface had introduced his compilation and explained his intent, Ivo's prologue went much further. If not explicitly dialectical, the prologue does anticipate some of the concerns soon to be addressed by the 12th century scholastic hermeneutic. For example, consideration of the canon's historical content and contemporary applicability. However, what is most striking to me is the Panormia compiler's intentional juxtaposition of canons, a methodological innovation beyond the structural omissions, additions, and arrangements of texts in earlier collections. It reveals concern for authority, finding an authoritative answer. It marks experimentation with tradition, which Professor Dussel has recently noted is more prevalent by 1100. It is slender evidence, I admit. Or perhaps the turning point is even signaled by those two brief rubrics, quaestio et solutio, added by later rubricators who recognized the contrast the Panormius compiler had intentionally presented. While we cannot overlook the importance of great men at the Curia, like Cardinals Anselm and Deusdedit, we should not ignore the plurality of interests of scribes and readers further afield. Such attention to them will remind us, as Dr. Brett remarks, quote, "It is not sufficient for a broad understanding of the intellectual ferment which transformed 12th and 11th century thought about the church, its nature, its regulations, and the world in which it operated. To study the various collections simply as units in an evolutionary sequence. The manuscripts in which they survive are the work of a living community of scribes, readers, and editors," end quote. Maintaining the older teleological evolutionary sequence, where the canon law turned towards Rome and then to Gratian. And also privileging famous compilers and the Curia. These do an injustice to those scribes, readers, and editors out in the provinces. It was in their multiple small worlds with quickly shifting alliances that we find the opportunities to write a fuller story of 11th century canon law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting, very interesting fresco. Un affresco ampio.
It's a very exhaustive and broad overview that has highlighted the interesting aspects of these collections. First and foremost, also the lack of critical editions and the difficulty in working on these texts. The lack of critical editions, which is caused both by the use of these manuscripts, so the wide tradition of the text, and also of this lack of stability of these texts. I would like to thank you. So thank you for being punctual and on time. I would like to ask the previous lecturers to come here with us so that we can start the Q&A session.
Professoressa Jacquin, la professoressa Storti. Aspettiamo un secondo la professoressa Storti. Eccoci, diamo inizio alla discussione.
Let's start with the Q&A session. Are there any questions concerning the first lecture by Professor Jacquin? Good evening, Rico Frosio, Catholic University of Milan. First of all, I would like to thank the lecturer of this afternoon for their very enriching lectures, and I would like to apologize for asking my question in Italian because my English and my French are not very well, I would say. I do not speak them very well. I would like to ask Professor Jacquin about the technical, medical knowledge that were circulating in the 11th century with the new knowledge. Are there cases of differences between new and old knowledge, and how are they solved? I mean, is there a simple mise à jour of the old knowledge with the new one, or is there a form of co-living of this new and old knowledge and of new and old authors, or if there are there's any form of harmonization of these two?
Vous me demandez, non?
There will be no translation from French into Italian. Let's see. Okay, so no translation from French into Italian.
A new medicine which arrives with translations from Arabic. Because in the early Middle Ages, before 11th century, medical texts in Latin, there were some translations from Greek, but not many. So it was very poor, and particularly for theoretical basis. So it's something quite new which arrives through the Arabic translation by Constantine the African. And after that, of course, there were other translations, both from Greek and from Arabic, which gave more elements. So I don't know if I answered to your question. Was it your question? And you know, in Arabic, it's a wide question to precisely describe the difference between the Greek heritage, medical, and Arabic. It's, of course, most of the background came from Greek, Galen mostly, but it was how to say, we built, you know, it was organized, and there were also new elements. So it's not exactly the same. I don't know if I answered. Thank you.
Are there further questions for Professor Jacquard? Are there further questions?
Passiamo dunque.
Let's then move on to the lecture of Professor Storti concerning imperial justice and the Scuola di Pavia. Professor Storti, if there are questions. Thank you, Professor Storti. Don't you believe that tacity and the formalities that you mentioned could be interpreted not only in an administrative sense, but also as a functional one? I mean, relative function, as Bernard Rell told. I tried to explain myself, given the fictional character of the trial, this latter was used to provide visibility to a composition that had already happened following a negotiation between the parties, but also to the social predominance of the members of the commission that were being represented and accepted of the boni omnes and the local social communities. As for the ban, when it comes to Tuscany, as I told you a few days ago when we were talking, the providing of the bannum might have had the function of substituting, let's say, the diplomi regi in confirming the goods in a region where, given the position, again, of this region, and a direct contact with the king was indeed more difficult. On the other hand, less formalities that we have found in the trials in Sabina and also in Romagna, think about Fermo, could hide a notary culture which was less standardized compared to Tuscany, and therefore this lower level of standardization might have shed light on the reality of trials in Tuscany, consisting in a filter of these 3-4 trials that you have mentioned. Thank you.
Questa questione se I placiti.
Thank you for your question. Whether the placiti simply represent the final conclusion of agreements that had already been made, or whether they were adversarial, as Wickham used to say, as is the right term in English, adversarial, could never be solved, I think, in my opinion. But, however, on the basis of what you can read in the formulas and the placiti, in all areas of Italy, by comparing all of them in different areas, I get the impression that a form of adversarial type or approach did exist nonetheless, except for the cases where the the subject, did not appear before the court. The fact that, here the the defendant did not appear before the court depended on the probability that the evidence they had at their disposal were successful ones or potentially successful ones. I do think that these disputes or these controversies about real estate or tax issues were extremely violent. And the fact that lawyers and notaries public participated was aimed at calming them down, because at least the president of the court, or whether emperor or missus, was able to prove on the basis of the argumentation of the judges, of the lawyers and so forth, that they were able to prove that there was a disagreement, that is a difference between the watershed between what was right and wrong. De facto, I have seen so many placiti, and unfortunately the complete documentation will be unattainable. We will never be able to get the whole documentation, but the feeling that there is a careful assessment of the evidence available. So for 30 or 40 years in the Langobard or Frank legal system, or the existence of papers or dossiers that could have been forged or counterfeited or extorted from someone, I do have the impression that underneath this layer there were many contrasts and very strong ones, and that many placiti have a formalized approach to disputes that were highly complex in their nature. And what I said about the questiones and interrogaciones, inferring from the glosses and the liber papiensis and so forth, well, the fact that it was formalized in the 12th century means, in my opinion, that there was a consolidated, well-established tradition of recurring to these tools. Well, in the trials of the 12th century, all these preparatory stage, or this before the judge, which is not yet the sentence or the trial itself, is quite evident. So in some cases, probably everything will have gone de plano, but in 1046 there was this case between the Bishop Cadalus of Vicenza. Sorry, I don't understand you exactly. A bishop from Parma actually is made ridiculous here. Is not so he does not appear before the court, but then he is able to escape or elude. Then he himself becomes a judge in the framework of a case of the following years. So he made a very bad impression here, and this is role play, let's say, which is highly complex. And is an example of the fact that all these concessions were not so stable, and on their consistency in time, it was not so no clarity was made, and everyone would play his own game in order to achieve as much as possible. I hope I was able to answer your question. As for the Bannum, can you tell more about the Bannum? The ban. Yes, it's true that in Tuscany it was very frequently used in formula, but not only in the Tuscany, in the region of Tuscany. So in my opinion, it depended on the single cases, and we are very well aware of this, that there are many nuances or differences between the regions, and already Wickham, back in 1996, had already highlighted the differences of practices in the courts, the different courts, the courtyards in an institutional context on the basis of the different regional organization. Well, that's true, but the Bannum is actually an institution that is not limited to Tuscany, and that actually is used by emperors as well. So by emperors, and I do believe when they needed to confirm their loyalty to somebody. Actually, it's a political use of legislation. When emperors wanted to ensure alliances with somebody, they would grant this Bannum, even though there had not been any investiture, salva querela, or other aspects. So the person wanting to be protected or safeguarded by a means of intervention of the emperor in the case of attacks in their territories, they would go to the emperor and ask them to receive the Bannum, to be given or granted a Bannum. And what happened in those cases? Any person having attacked, well, those quietly benefiting or enjoying those goods would have incurred in a very severe crime, punishable by criminal justice, by the criminal justice of the empire. It was a form of safeguard of protection because it was very often used, as can be read in the diplomas and in the placiti. It was very frequent. It happened very frequently that somebody actually took action, practical action against someone or something, and if the other resisted, well, they ended up before the court. So it's actually a use of tools that actually depended on, we're talking about legal tools, of course, that depended very strongly on the attitude of the conflicting parties as to the possession of certain goods. I hope it's clear enough. But actually, we're talking about general institutions, because the Bannum was subsequently used in a different manner in the different regions. But in terms of imperial justice, it had this very function.
Grazie. Altre domande?
Thank you. Any question?
Se non ci sono altre domande sulla...
If there are no further questions for Professor Storti, let's now concentrate on the questions to Professor Brasington. Actually, I would have a question. May I? I will ask the question in Italian. You mentioned the use of penitenziali. To what extent did penitenziali enter into these collections of the Panormia and Ivo? Talking about penitential texts, was there any influence or not?
Thank you for your question. Burckhardt 19th book, The Corrector, is penitential. And not only is it attached to Burckhardt, but it also gets transmitted independently. As for later collections, if we move to the end of the 11th century, there are penitential texts in the works, the collections attributed to Evo, but there is no dedicated section. So it's not like either the Corrector or when you go to the De Penitentia in Gratian later. Mm-hmm. No, there is a scattering of penitential texts. Now, so yes, there is influence, right, but not a dedicated section that at least I can think of right now. Now, what you have also, as I come back to the added and omitted canons in the different manuscripts of the Bonormia, you will have penitential texts added, and you also will see penitential texts added in appendices. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
D'abord, je veux remercier tous les trois pour ces contributions magnifiques. Era davvero una sessione bilingua, plurilingua, che mi è piaciuto tantissimo. I will ask my question in English, so that's for Professor Brasington. Okay. I will ask you something actually about the manuscripts, because you have been talking about, which I like very much, you've been talking about the books of use. And of course, that's something that is very typical, I think, for law books and canon collections. Now, but I wanted to say, if you encountered in your research also manuscripts that might have served as exemplaries, because of course exemplaries they can show something like an attempt to standardization. When you really have a manuscript that is meant not just as a book of use. Of course, they will always be used, I know this. Right. But of course, when you see that the book is also meant to be an exemplary for a model book for other collections, then you can have a kind of attempt to standardize this kind of collection. Just an open question, because I don't know if you would.
It's an extremely interesting question, obviously, from a codicological standpoint. There may well be, I think of Cambridge Corpus Christi manuscript of Vivos Decretum. But I cannot think, and this is just my immediate reaction, of any indication that there's some sort of standard form. The mise en scène, the mise en page, excuse me, is so varied. I will never say never. There are too many manuscripts, and I haven't seen all of them. So I'm afraid I will have to say I don't think so, but I also have to say I don't know for sure. Okay, that's not a good answer, but it's an honest one. Okay, okay. Thank you. Now I'll think about it. Okay.
Altre domande?
Are there further questions?
Non vedo altre mani alzate.
Since I don't see any other raised hands, I would like to thank the lecturer for these very interesting lectures. They have been all three very rich in insights and food for thought. So once again, thank you for participating this afternoon, and I will see you tomorrow morning. Remember that tomorrow morning we will start at 9:45. Thank you. Have a nice evening.